wasn't able to make it today. All right, did anyone get a recording in process notification? Good, awesome. All right, so let's get going. So this month we're talking about animal orchids. Um, so these are orchids that, that resemble animals. It's just a really cool niche in my opinion. Um, so these guys are, they vary from, I don't know, mammals to avians to even things that aren't, I don't know, typical animals. So let's kind of talk about that and the pollinators that interact with them. So a lot of these orchids, their animal-like shape kind of has to do with the method of deceit that they use to attract these pollinators. So some of them will pretend to be another type of flower. Some of them will smell like the insect mate of a certain kind of insect, you know, pretend to be like a pretty lady bumblebee. Um, some of them will even pretend to be a fungus, which is a living thing technically, which is pretty cool. And some of them just pretend to be other things, just absolutely wild. Um, they use all just sorts of different mechanisms to get their goal of being pollinated. So we're gonna jump right into some that I don't know are a little easier. So this one was so beautiful. When I learned what it was, I couldn't not include it in this like presentation. Um, And so this is Queen of Sheba. So this is actually a sun orchid that pretends to be a lily. It has a specialized yellow column that bees mistake for the lily anther. So the bees that interact with this use a process called buzz pollination. So they flap their wings like really, really fast to try and knock the pollen off of the lily. But since this isn't a lily, there's no pollen to knock off, so they actually just pollinate the orchid in the process of being fooled. Um, these are super beautiful. These are found in Western Australia, along with a lot of the other orchids we're going to talk about tonight, which actually a biodiversity hotspot. It's one of the top 45 in the world. And I'm just so jealous of people in Western Australia that they get to see like beautiful plants like this. Um, And then, so we're going to move on to one that also isn't technically an animal, but the helmet orchid pretends to be a fungus. So there's a special type of fungus gnats that they mistake these orchids for the fungus that they think is a food source. And in the process of checking them out and trying to get their food source, they actually pollinate the orchid. These guys are super, super small. So they're basically huge to a fungus gnat. And it's just really interesting, all the different kinds of things that orchids can pretend to be. Moving on to our bee orchid. This is a personal favorite of mine. I remember reading about this in The Orchid Hunter, which is a really great book that I would definitely recommend. And he talks about how the bee orchid is actually the first orchid he ever saw as a child, and it inspired him to get into orchids and be really into nature because he was like, oh man, like they can look like this. Um, the ones we're going to talk about today are also come like from Western Australia, but they can be found in a lot of different places, and there are a bunch of different kinds of this kind of species. Um, these guys pollinate through, I think, is the loneliest type of betrayal of sexual deceit. So the lips of the orchid are colored to look like a bee. So this male bee, he's like flying around and he sees a pretty female bumblebee and he's like, wow, like you look great. And he kind of tries to get with her. And in the process of being unfortunately rejected by this flower, he pollinates this orchid. So he kind of loses some of the pollen from his pollen sacs and he picks up some of the pollen that's hanging out on the orchid.
It's really interesting too, because a lot of these orchids, there's a few other orchids that are, sexual mimics that pretend to be the female species. they will actually produce pheromones of the female. So they're highly tailored to a particular insect that they're trying to attract. And a lot of the flowering times too correspond to like a week before the females come out too. It's this whole complex relationship. So it's very interesting.
Really neat. That's also that has to do really well with this one, the fruit fly orchid, along with looking absolutely otherworldly. This guy doesn't he doesn't put off the pheromone of the female fruit fly. They put off methyl eugenol, and so this fruit fly smells this methyl eugenol, and it's like, oh, this is really good because it knows. So it flies onto the lip hinges, and the fly becomes trapped in the orchid, and it must pollinate the flower in the process of freeing itself. But while it's stuck, it knows to lick the sides of the orchid, like the walls, and it takes a chemical from the orchid that goes into some special glands in the rectal area of the fruit fly. And it turns into a chemical that produces the aroma for the fly to attract female flies, which is just crazy. Like how can a plant I mean that's like the essence of a symbiotic relationship. So that one I thought was really interesting. I told everyone at work about this one today. Moving on to another type of kind of flying insect. Lisa's going to tell us about moth orchids.
So I think everyone's familiar with Phalaenopsis or moth orchids. They're not actually pollinated by moths. They just resemble moths in their shape. They've got those big petals that kind of look like wings. And Phalaenopsis, phal means moth, and opsis is like. So the species or the genus actually means moth-like. But they're a pretty orchid that, looks kind of like an animal.
Who would have thought some of these neat guys are just everyday, just like us? This guy is a little not everyday though. The white egret orchids. So the legend on this one is that it was like born from the soul of an exhausted egret. So like this bird was flying, and I don't know, maybe it crash landed and just transferred all of its energy into this plant. But either way, it's totally beautiful. For this one, we're going to talk about this really interesting study that was done, um, which highlights, I think, everything we know about pollinators. So these are pollinated by nocturnal hawk moths and skipper butterflies. Um, so what's really the hawk moths, they don't always use the petal. So they kind of look like hummingbirds. They're really big moths, and they'll flap their wings. Sometimes they'll like perch themselves on the flower to try and get the nectar that's inside. And their proboscis or beak, their mouth part, is long enough to reach the nectar. So they can get in there and get it, and they pollinate, and they do what they got to do. But the skipper butterflies can't reach the nectar. So they perch on the petal, they perch on the lip, really. And there's some other kind of grips that they use on the flower, but mainly the lip. And they try and reach the nectar, but their mouth part isn't long enough. And they pollinate it in the effort of trying. And so normally these skipper butterflies will go to a couple, realize it's just not working, and they'll leave. But they'll pollinate a good amount in the process of realizing that it's just not going to happen. And so the study was like, okay, well, is the lip what's really kind of keeping this relationship going? So they took the lip off a population of orchids, and they left some on, so they have a control and an independent variable. And what they found was that the hawk moths used it also for like kind of like a visual. So it's nighttime, so they use like this big white lip as like something to aim for. And in the process of also the skipper butterflies couldn't kind of get a good grip on it, so they couldn't do their thing as well. So both of the pollinators, when the lip comes off, couldn't interact with the plant properly. And they found that the flowers that had the lips taken off had less seeds. So they weren't able to produce as much seeds. And they kind of gathered that from all of this, the interaction, well, the lack of interaction is why. Um, that one was really, really cool to kind of see like an actual study done, and how much does the shape of the orchid really kind of, I don't know, affect the entire rest of the world and the survival of the species, or at least the colony that it's in. Another kind of bird one, we have the flying duck orchid. These guys look way, these are way cooler than I think they need to be. Um, so the lip is on a hinge. So these are another kind of mechanical trap. So when any insect touches it, it springs and it traps them inside of the lip. Um, so they have small mosquitoes and I think some wasps that are attracted to them, but science doesn't know why yet. So that's another study that could be done, hopefully someday by someone. I don't know, all the studying that's been doing on orchids is really interesting. And they do know, though, that when these insects, for whatever reason, go up to the flowers, they get trapped inside of them, they don't shoo their way out like some pollinators do. They crawl back up. So they kind of like work their way up. And in the process, they pollinate it on their way out. Why it looks like a flying duck, I couldn't find any information on. So all we can really do is enjoy it. Kind of going into the insects now. Um, the fringed mantis orchid is pretty cool. This guy looks really alien. I can definitely see the resemblance to like a mantis with the really long legs. Um, what's really neat about these is they have these osmophore clubs on the petals. So osmophore, they're basically specialized little kind of, I would say they look kind of like a golf tee. Um, and these are ones that use smell to attract wasps. So they smell like the female wasp. And when the male wasp comes to kind of take away his lady, because the female wasps don't have wings, so they cannot fly. So they're one that gets picked up. Their sexual mating is done in the air, and then the female is kind of returned to a safe place, and the male feeds her. So this male wasp is going around. He thinks he's really found it. And he goes to grab this female and take her away and do the act, and he can't. So all he can do is pollinate the orchid. Um, and he's looking for this lady, and he's going all over, and he's doing a great job pollinating. Um, the study that was done on these, basically, they took these clubs off and they removed them, and they were like, are the wasps interested if this kind of like scent isn't there? And it turns out they weren't. They're really only interested in this part of the orchid. So they'll go directly to these specialized petals instead of the rest of the flower. Next, we have donkey orchids. These are really fun. Let me kind of get this out of the way. I really enjoy how big these ones are. I didn't really know what to expect with something called a donkey orchid, but basically their deceit is, I don't know, they're so big they look smaller. So they grow in pretty close proximity to the pea plants to try and take advantage of the bee's ability to perceive colors. A study was done on these that used UV lights, because as you can kind of see in this top picture, they have this darker coloring. And what this darker coloring really does is it mimics the shape of a pea flower. So everything that's not dark looks like a pea flower if you isolate it. So a study was done and they kind of blasted some of these flowers with UV light to see if that would make the color, well, the UV light makes kind of that pea-shaped flower stand out more because it makes the dark darker and it makes the light lighter. And they found that from the right distance, which is 8 meters away, that bees were more likely to go to the ones that were blasted with UV light. Because that is, they found from the study, how far away bees need to be able to perceive color. So these kind of deceitful guys are doing a really good job. And it's really interesting that they have to be within a pretty close proximity of both other plants that they're trying to imitate and the pollinator. If the pollinator is too far or too close, they'll know that it's a trick and they won't be interested.
And this is because a lot of orchids don't offer nectar rewards, and then they don't have the pollen either that a lot of these bees are looking for to make their honey or to make provisions for their young. So they look similar to some of these other plants that are really big pollinators, and are really good for the pollinators that offer a lot of nectar, as a way to trick these bees. So it's really interesting and another super complex relationship that's just fascinating about orchids.
Yeah, I think it really highlights how kind of interconnected everything is. Ooh, these guys are really fun.
This is like a classic one. I think if you ask anyone what orchid looks like an animal, they'll say, the monkey face orchid or Dracula's. And this is a whole genus that are kind of similar in that they all kind of have flowers that resemble a monkey face. And this isn't because they're pollinated by monkeys or anything. This just has to do with, our brains looking for faces and seeing things that might not actually be there. Because these guys are actually pollinated by fungus gnats. So we go back to the bulbophyllum that we saw earlier and the Corybus species that we saw before too. The lip on these mimic a shelf fungus. So it's kind of like a double deceit here. We've got mimicry, and then we also perceive a whole different aspect of the flower. But they're just a really cool and really fun species of orchids.
I get excited whenever I see these guys like in a botanical garden because it's like, oh,
They're so cute too. I mean, like, they're just adorable.
they're cute little friends. Um, and kind of like, I don't know, along that line of moving from kind of big things, small things, little things, we kind of have some that look like humans. These guys are super exciting. It's not because maybe you're spending too much time with your orchids, they start to look like you start to look like them. That's a different complex relationship that I think everyone should sort out in their own way. um, this is, I think, one of the better examples. I think it's super beautiful. So this ballerina orchid specifically is also from Western Australia, and it looks like a beautiful ballerina in mid pirouette. I personally feel like it looks a little bit like a duck ballerina kind of like very what's that one ballet? Swan Lake. This is Swan Lake. Um, they look beautiful, but they don't really smell beautiful. They have an odor of burning metal. I don't know exactly what that smells like. I don't think. I don't think I want to be reminded. Um, but I don't, what I found about these was exciting because so they're found in Western Australia, which I mentioned is like a huge biodiversity hotspot. but they're critically endangered in Western Australia right now. So they're actually threatened by grazing. One of their main grazers is kangaroos. So if you have any beef against kangaroos, this is one to add to your list. Um, I wouldn't really try and stop them grazing though, because kangaroos would probably put up a pretty good fight. I did find though this really great plan of conservation for this particular orchid. And one of the big reasons that this plan, I think, made it through, because it's kind of hard to get any kind of government document to save things, was because this particular plant is found near a lot of other populations of things that are a little bit less endangered. So saving this one species would benefit like a huge ecosystem around it, which I think is a really great summary of how interconnected everything is with like the pollinators. I mean, they pollinate other plant species as well, which is really kind of important to remember that this is all just really interconnected. And it's great that there are people out there who have a great plan to try and save them and help our ecosystem. We do have one that we found. There was only one. So we kind of went over some mammals. We went over orchids that look like primates, orchids that look like people, but we haven't talked about any kind of orchids that interact directly with any kind of mammal. So there's only one study that Lisa and I were able to find, and that is a Cymbidium serratum, and the wild mountain mouse. These are in China. Um, and what's really cool about this interaction is basically the orchids have adapted so that they offer their lip as food to the mice. So these mice are scurrying around, they see this orchid, they're like, yes, a good meal. And in the process of eating the orchid, they kind of get pollen all over themselves. And then when they move on to the next plant, they kind of wiggle that pollen out and grab some new stuff. So they're pollinators. Really exciting. Um, so both the color and the smell of the cymbidium attract the mice, which is just a really cool relationship to see. At least you have anything to add on this one?
Not really. Mammals are kind of bad pollinators just because they don't move around too much and they're really busy, so they don't quite get as much spread as something like a bee would that's actively going from flower to flower. And mice can be really destructive too, so you risk losing your entire flower if you offer it for mice. But there was this one study that found these cymbidiums were pollinated by mice, and I thought it was kind of interesting because there's always exceptions to the rules. There's always some different interactions that you can find.
It's definitely exciting. I'm gonna put the link to some of these studies too when we upload this on YouTube, because it's really interesting to see some of the research that's being done and has been done on orchids. There's a whole world out there that we're still discovering. There's like, this is the biggest like family of genus of flowering plants. Oh, sorry, my brain is not working right now. um, I mean, but there are just so many different types, and they have all of them have like little complex relationships of their own. And there are tons of really interesting studies and research that's being done and has been done, and it's worth checking out. Great to be informed on the world. But since we did use some of these studies, we did have some references. So thank you to everyone who did any work that we were able to kind of use to all become more knowledgeable about these really interesting animal orchids. We want to thank everyone for coming out and enjoying our presentation and open the floor to any questions.
Hi, there are some orchids that are pollinated by bats, aren't there? Hello?
At
Oh,
least might be one for you.
so I don't know of any specific orchids pollinated by bats. Um, bats would like, larger white flowers or lighter colored flowers. And they really like nectar too. So there could be more that are pollinated by bats that I just didn't find in my research, but that would definitely be something that I'd look into.
I I did watch a special where it was a very specific bat that did indeed pollinate a very specific orchid. I want to say it was in central South America somewhere.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look this up now and get back to you on that because that's very interesting.
I think that the closest thing we have to that, though, is kind of like the relationship between the hawk moth and the white egret orchid and how they use that, big white bright as something to see in the dark. Which is just really interesting. Is there anyone else?
I was curious if there's anyone who actually grows any of these orchids and what special conditions do they provide?
So I don't personally grow Draculas, but I know there are a few people here that do. And Draculas are very similar to Masdevallias. There are some cooler growing species, or most of them are cooler growing, and there's a few warm growing species. But honestly, it's, looking up the particular species and knowing or figuring out the care requirements. Um, because they're, have different pollinators doesn't necessarily control their growing conditions. It's more, where they're from.
Can anyone hear me? This
Yeah.
is Donna. Hello?
We can hear
Yeah.
you, Donna.
Hear you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to say I thank you both for really doing this. I thought it was a fascinating talk. And since we don't have a lot of people here tonight, I'm trying to figure out a way to have you present maybe a small portion of this to the general meeting, because I think everybody would really enjoy it.
That could be cool. We could try and figure that out. Some of these
And
are
maybe we could, if we could do a 5-minute presentation or 7-minute presentation, and because there's an awful lot of stuff here that you've researched that I think most people haven't heard before, even some of our longer term members, including me. So I think they'd be very interested in this.
Yeah, we can definitely put something short and sweet together.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
And I'm going to see if I can find anything about bat pollinated orchids. I somehow had the idea that that was just something that happened, but maybe I made the whole thing up.
No, I mean, there are always exceptions. There's always some other things that you can find and
Oh, yeah.
some exceptions to the rule. So it wouldn't.
What I think you're thinking of, there are a huge amount of bat pollinated plants in the tropics, phenomenal amount, but I don't know how many of them are orchids. I just don't know what that percentage is. But in terms of general pollinators in the tropics, bats are very, very important pollinators. Hello?
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not know that. Of course, we think of bats as just eating insects because around here that's what they do. But in the tropics, of course, there's fruit bats.
No,
too.
I think they were. I went on a trip to the tropics with somebody from the New York Botanical Gardens years ago, and he couldn't stop talking about the importance of bat pollinators. So I know they're very important.
Yeah.
I just don't know how important they are to orchids.
Well, I don't know. think between all of us, we can get to the bottom of it. There's so many orchids too, you know. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some relationship.
Mhm.
It'd be actually kind of surprising if there wasn't, because there are so many species, you know, and they've been so ingenious in figuring out all these very convoluted ways of getting pollinated. You know, there are bats, there are orchids. They must have happened at least a few times.
I'm sure there are. I can't believe there aren't, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that.
We'll have to get back to you on our next meeting. We'll
Okay.
meet up and
Thank
see
you
what we
so
can
much,
come up
guys.
with.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank
So
you
we'll
all
put
for
this,
joining.
we'll put this online and it will be there for future viewing. And hopefully to everyone who's watching this that wasn't able to make it, thank you for watching.
And thank you both for your time.
Thank you. Well,
All right.
I
Thank
think
you.
we hope you all have a great night. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
good
Good
night.
night.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.